Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Place.
Do you have any particular lineup in mind?
You're here, and
Yes,
here's
does
the
that
time.
mean I'm the next speaker or what?
Yeah.
I'm calling you last.
Okay.
You need to get settled in.
So we have the most experience out of all of us.
Great.
What are you talking about?
Forever. Great to see you too. Okay.
I think we met at the Highland Club and you
We
were talking.
did. So I'm so happy to see you. And actually,
Exact same thing.
Mayor Harold over at my place the other day, and she was saying, "Oh my God, you've got to get together with them." And I said, "Yeah, when I catch a minute, I'd be happy to."
You know how you
So
feel? Sure.
I'm gonna turn my phone off.
Umbrellas, one sock and one glove.
Indeed.
Are you guys ready?
Contributed clinic.
I'm going to kick us off here. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We're going to get started here, and I'll start by droning on with the stuff that you probably aren't as interested in. Today is Friday, April 14th. Welcome to the Conference on World Affairs. My name is Sam Weaver, and I'll be the moderator today. The session is entitled Democracy in Hotter Times. And before we move on to the subject, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of indigenous peoples that have traversed, lived in, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. And another thing that I would like to mention is that in our session today, we would like to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to ask questions, and we're going to handle Q&A a little differently than it's been handled in the past at the CWA. The end of the discussion, the last 20 minutes, will be focused on your questions, and we'll be using a note card system to get questions from the audience. Anytime during the panel that you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand, and one of the producers will come around and bring you a note card and a pencil, and you can write your question on a card, and it will be brought up here, and I'll use it to ask questions at the end of the session. Please write legibly. Please keep the questions short. I won't have a lot of time to interpret them, so I'm probably just going to read them as they are. And the last thing about Q&A is we'd like to emphasize student participation, so I will prioritize questions that come from any college students or high school students. If you'll just write student at the top, I'll know that you're a student asking the question. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction to the panelists. My name is Sam Weaver. I work in energy technology. I was on Boulder City Council for 8 years and the mayor for the last 2019 to 2021. And this panel means a lot to me because when I first got on council was in 2013, immediately after the huge floods that we had in 2013. And I can tell you that climate change impacts hijacked my life for a year while all we did was talk about flood recovery. Some of the other folks here have got various ways that they've interacted with climate and democracy. David Orr was a professor at Oberlin University for 27 years in environmental studies. He is now at Arizona State University. He's the founder of Solutions, which is an Oberlin sustainability project, and David will tell us more about himself later. Claudine Schneider, immediately to my right, 10 years in Congress as a congressperson from Rhode Island, worked on global warming legislation while she was there, speaker consultant currently on these subjects. Kirk Siegler is with us. He's a correspondent with NPR News. He focuses on Western issues, in particular climate change. And then Lev S., a name that I will butcher, so I won't butcher. You can read it in your program. He's here at Leeds at CU Boulder. He's a professor, a teaching professor, and he focuses on environmental and social justice issues. So with that, we're going to start, and each panelist will give us 3 minutes on their background and how they think about this problem of democracy in hotter times. And if it's okay, David Orr, I'd like to start with you.
I was hoping you were going to go down the line, but you didn't.
I like to keep things uncertain.
You did that. In 3 minutes, climate change and democracy are two of the crisis and existential issues of our time. And we tend to think of them as separate kinds of things. In the work I do at Arizona State University and in a group we have assembled here in Colorado, the CDI initiative, several members of that group are here, including John Powers, and Peter Brown may come in just a few minutes. But what we're assuming is, number one, that climate change is a long-term problem. We can say whatever you want, but it will be a long time, measured in hundreds of thousands of years, before the Earth restabilizes. Most of the heating has occurred in the oceans or gone into the oceans. So 93 or 4 or 5% of the heating we've released, which is roughly equivalent to 3 atomic-sized, Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs going off every second, every day, every week. That's a lot of heat being released. Most of that's going to the ocean. So it's a long-term issue. It isn't going to be solved in a way that you fix a broken car. It's not that kind of issue. So the cause of this is on the other side of the coin. It is democracy. We knew enough a long time ago to do much better on climate and energy issues than we have subsequently done. And the question now is, how do we do better? The default setting for, I think, all of us on this planet is authoritarian solutions. Run the film fast forward. Most people believe that we've got to centralize power and create some kind of climate leviathan to actually manage human affairs on the Earth. Our assumption is radically different, that the only way we are going to manage or deal with climate is to rebuild democratic institutions. So that is the purpose of what we're doing at Arizona State, what we're doing here in Colorado and elsewhere. We have a book coming out from MIT Press in midsummer called Democracy in a Hotter Time. Bill McKibben wrote the foreword, Kim Stanley Robinson wrote the afterword to the book, and there are 16 great essays sandwiched in between. So the last thing I'd say is this. I think the question for us here is, what do we do about this? And one of the things that we're proposing is that no student graduate from any university, including Colorado University, without knowing what planet they live on and how that planet works. And no student graduates without understanding the basic rules, the civic rules of a civil democratic society. And no student thoroughly graduates without understanding how these two things are related and why they're important to their lives and careers. And then, what do universities do? Yesterday at a panel, I suggested getting rid of your football team and saving yourselves a lot of money. That was not, well, there are a few of you that support the idea, but universities are combinations. It's an organization with basically 11 purposes, from teaching all the way out to alumni affairs. It includes investing and spending and all the ways universities function in the world. So climate change ought to entail a large shift in what universities do and how they do it. And starting with the training of a new generation of climate leaders that understand that we are citizens in both a democracy and in an ecosphere. So if there is hope to be found on these issues, it is in a rebirth of universities as agents of creating democracy, call it 4.0. Democracy 1.0 was all the previous tribal democracies. 2.0 is Athens. 3.0 began in a hotel room in Philadelphia and also in France in 1789 to 1795. 4.0 has yet to be invented. And it's a democracy that will give rights to future generations, other species, land forms. It'll be much more just, fair, and decent. Those aren't just good things to do. They are, if we're going to solve the climate crisis or manage the climate crisis, there are necessary things to do.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. And Democracy 4.0, we'll come back to that, I promise. Next, we have Claudine Schneider. Claudine, what do you think about what's coming?
Well, since you asked me to introduce myself first, I'm going to do a little bit of that because in looking at the crowd and the age of the crowd, with all due respect, it does not necessarily mean you are closer to death than I was when I was 25 years old. And I was told I had a 50-50 chance of living because I had a form of cancer. And that I attributed to growing up right outside of Pittsburgh, which was one of the most polluted places one could imagine. And very quickly at age 25, I started thinking, why am I here? What is my purpose? And I hope that each and every one of you in this audience today asks yourself that question, because here we are at a moment in history when it requires all hands on deck. That means I don't care if you're retired, there are still things you can do to guarantee that our democracy is secure and that our climate is livable for not only today, but future generations. So unbelievably, asking how I can serve, I was elected to the US Congress, even though the registration in Rhode Island was 15 Democrats to every one Republican. I ran as a Republican because I didn't want to be part of the good old boys club. I thought, you know, even if I don't win, I'm going to run my campaign differently, and I'm going to talk about issues that I believe are important, and that is the environment and how we spend taxpayers' dollars. I introduced the first and only revenue-neutral Global Warming Prevention Act in 1989. I had 140 co-sponsors on that bill, bipartisan co-sponsors on that bill. Parts of it passed, like, for example, when you go to buy a refrigerator and it has an Energy Star rating on it, that was my legislation. But after serving in Congress for 10 years, I taught briefly at Harvard, and then I was asked by two businessmen to join them in a business. And I was very excited because we were going to do energy efficiency and renewables and prove to the country that you can make money, do well by doing good at the same time. And so that's exactly what we did. And there too, we had a 10-year exit strategy. So where am I today? I made a pledge that I am going to keep working on climate, and when Donald Trump got elected, got to keep working on democracy. So I formed something called Republicans for Integrity and pulled together my former colleagues from the House and the Senate to speak up and let it be known that our democracy is on the ropes. And until every single human being, regardless of party, stands up for what is truthful, what is right, what is good, then we are missing our responsibility and a critical opportunity. So I am pushing CU to do everything it can in both of those respects. I am partially out of breath right now because I was zipping around the parking lot wondering, why do we have so many cars on campus when we're trying to reduce our greenhouse gases? There needs to be a policy here. Why does CU continue to invest in the fossil fuel industry and their pension funds in areas where they do not do anything to contribute either to democracy or to climate mitigation? So.
Very good. That's a very inspiring background. Thank you very much. And Kirk, tell us a little bit about where you sit before we go to where you stand.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm a reporter, so of course I can't tell you where I stand, but I'm sitting, so I'm good. So I cover the West, as was said, mostly for NPR. I spend a lot of time in rural communities that were dependent and are still dependent on natural resources. And I would say that climate change touches just about every story we're doing these days in the West. But I was going to kick this off by traveling far away from the West, which I did a few months ago, and I went into the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon. So you might be thinking, why is the Western correspondent going to the Brazilian Amazon? Hopefully I'll get you back there and answer that in 3 minutes. But if I was thinking of bringing it up as an example when we're asked to talk about how climate change is threatening democracy, a great place to zero in on is the Amazon, which is being deforested at a record rate, in particular under the former Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, who's now residing in no other place but Florida. But he presided over a period of record deforestation, and that's not to say it wasn't going on before Bolsonaro took office or took power in Brazil. But you also, when you travel there, you also see that what is also going on is that many people, and you can make an argument about being preyed upon or in vulnerable situations, but a lot of people who live there, and the Amazon is not just a jungle, there are a lot of people living there. There's a city of 2 million people there, Manaus, and people are dependent on the land. Many indigenous people are dependent on the land. They're dependent on logging and, to some extent, mining. But that has been going on at a record pace, and the amount of enforcement has dropped. And so people are forced into positions where they have no other choice but to deforest the Amazon to survive. So I think you might see some of that corrected a bit under the Lula, the new president. But I think there's a portent there, if not maybe even a parallel to what might be coming soon here in the American West, if not it has already begun. These are communities, rural, natural resource-dependent towns that are experiencing a lot of wildfires as a result of forest management decisions, but also climate change and drought crippling the forests. The river, the Colorado River and its tributaries are at record low flows, this year notwithstanding. And these are straining communities, and these are the social conditions that we know around the world and from history that are ripe for authoritarians to come in and capitalize on economic frustrations, economic resentment. If you were to look at, which you probably all have, most rural counties in the West, those notwithstanding that are university towns or ski resort towns, most went overwhelmingly for Trump, who comes in the politics of grieving, and these are the kinds of conditions when people are facing that authoritarians can capitalize on. So I guess to bring it back to home, there are many examples where this may not happen, but I think it is what's happening in Brazil and all around the world where we're seeing people in very desperate situations, in part or largely as a result of climate change and a changing, erratic climate, are really straining places, and I think there is a connection to be made, and it's one we ought to watch.
Thank you very much, Kirk. And I'll turn to Lev for the last word. Lev, tell us a little bit about your background and how you think about the problem of democracy in hotter times.
Thank you very much. Sitting next to David and Claudine and Kirk, I'm humbled by being part of this panel. So thank you for all of the work that you're all doing, and Betsy and Sam and all the organizers. It's refreshing to see so many young people in the audience. I'd love to see more. But I'm hoping that this is speaking to David's focus as well of thinking about the university as an agent of change. So I am specialized in environmental justice, social justice, and a lot of my research has focused on public health concerns, inequities in our responses, and this clearly is tied to issues of climate change. But I really like this panel that gives me a chance to step back from what I focus on to think about some of the broader implications. So the way I view climate change, beyond being the greatest public health crisis we have ever faced, is thinking about how our responses are threatening democratic values, not necessarily institutions per se, but the values themselves. So I look, for instance, at the disproportionate risk and harm. We don't need to go too far to see cases of environmental discrimination. Jackson, Mississippi, with undrinkable water, still as a consequence of the flooding, which has been tied to climate change. Lithium mining in Bolivia and Argentina. Cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the concern about child labor. We can imagine instances, or we can find lots of instances where we have vulnerable groups that are at disproportionate risk of harm. Even in Louisville, where I live, I serve on our Louisville Sustainability Advisory Board. The city is considering a moratorium on the construction of new gasoline stations with the hope that it will prompt folks to invest in electric vehicles. These aren't emissions free. So one of the concerns that I have raised is that, well, look, we get our power from various counties, the coal burning power plants. Look at Adams County with Commerce City. Until our grid is electrified, all we're doing as affluent communities is outsourcing those emissions. And so we need to be mindful of these inequities. I also worry about our dogmatic faith in technology as a panacea. Think about geoengineering. This was in NPR not recently, not too long ago. We are geoengineering, trying to create storm clouds to address the issue of lack of water and drought in the western part of our country. And we are using silver iodide and shooting them in big cannons to try to create storm clouds. Clean meat. We are taking cells of actual animals and we are creating meat in the lab. So the thought that we can just sit back and continue our lifestyles and technology will get us there, let's just have faith, I think is quite a concern. Electrification too. All of the investment in solar panels and electric vehicles. These are part of the solution, of course, but I'm worried that we as a community need to adopt better responses, value-based assessments of our own contributions to the problems and the solutions that we can help to bring about. Prioritization of individualism, for instance, over our obligations to our community. I'm seeing the consumption habits, they're not changing. Louisville, just a year and a half ago, experienced the Marshall Fire, attributed to climate change, drought, lack of snowfall. And if you drive down 36 and you come into our town, you're gonna start seeing all sorts of rebuilding. A highly affluent city that is now rebuilding homes twice as big as you saw before. What's the thought? Greater energy efficiency, better insulation, solar panels, great. But it has to be part of a broader response where we take greater responsibility. Not to mention globally, the growing middle income countries. You have countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China. They're approaching middle class status. They're starting to gain more affluence. They want to spend more and have higher standards of living. These are going to entail exponential or contribute exponentially to the problems we're facing. And then the last one is thinking about the young folks. Some of my students are in the audience as well. One of the challenges as a faculty member is to try to push back against the cynicism. There's a lot of heaviness even in these 4 introductions. Everything's going sideways, retired or not. There's this burden that we're all facing. And I think this generation is the first generation that has grown up with this reality, bombarded by problem after problem. And I think that one of the things that we need to conscientiously do is to try to emphasize the importance and significance of the incrementalism that defines our political system as creating stability in our democracy, and that we don't need to be too discouraged to emphasize those meaningful achievements we have made to give our younger generations a sense that there is progress to be made.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And I'll remind everyone, raise your hand if you want to write a question down and send it up this way. For the next phase here, I'm going to ask questions to seed conversation among the panelists, but we're looking forward to yours as well. So I'll start by saying that I was mayor of Boulder, and so I got to know extremely well the fact that mayors and county commissioners are very close to their constituents. We know them, we see them every day in the grocery store and so on. But there's other levels of government, and pretty quickly, even when you're an elected representative, you run up into the restrictions of power that you're only able to talk about your city, but the changes that need to be made to correct and to mitigate some of the climate change have to come from global changes, as well as national changes and state level changes. So there's this complexity that you can have, say, Nashville, a blue city in a red state, to take a current example, where the city may want to do one thing and the other layers of government above may have other concepts. So I'll turn to the panelists and say, in the context of democracy and the fact that it exists at these different kind of scales, how are we going to break down the barriers that let us do kind of coordinated action? And I'm going to start with you, Claudine, because you've been at the other end of the government spectrum.
Well, when I say it's time for all hands on deck, I am not kidding. I have been living in Boulder for almost 25 years now, and I moved out here because of the 3 national labs that focus on climate. But, and my focus while living here has been not so much local, but more national, the world I came from, and have felt and fought very strongly about making sure that we have a responsible Congress. But now the shift has been moving to the local governments, and beyond the local determinations, it's now integrating into another sector of our democracy. As you all know, we have 3 different parts. We have the executive branch, we have the legislative branch, and we have the judicial branch. And unfortunately, now so much of our democracy is being determined by the judicial branch. So it's absolutely critical that we pay close attention to what is going on in all levels of government. We're very fortunate that we have some great local leaders here in Louisville and in Boulder, but and we have some terrific leaders in the state legislature and in Congress, but that's not enough. If you get complacent, then look briefly beyond our borders to some of the other states and get involved in some of the nonprofit organizations that are on the front lines, making sure that local governments continue to have a voice and that the federal government is not overriding many of the decisions, nor that the courts are overriding many of the decisions of local public participation. That is what democracy is all about, and that's what we need to protect against right now. So we need to look at all different levels, not just in Colorado, but beyond. And there are many great nonprofit organizations. I'm happy to recommend a few that you would want to be a part of, either financially and or otherwise.
Very good. Thank you, Claudine. Kirk, what do you think about the many layers of government and how to coordinate?
Well, you mentioned the Nashville situation. I mean, it's something we cover in the news media increasingly. And 3 years ago or so, NPR relocated me to Boise, Idaho, to be better positioned to cover Trump's America, basically. In fact, I pitched it over Denver. They were going to move me here because Denver's a little bit more central. But even in conservative Idaho, the largest county in the state, Ada County, which includes Boise, which is moving a little bit to blue, but it's still a red county. But they, for years, have had an emissions testing requirement, and the state Republican supermajority-controlled legislature just overturned it. And these sorts of actions by people who once professed they were in favor of local control are happening all around the country. It's difficult to cover, but I think that probably is a thing that is above my pay grade that probably other people are working on. But that's certainly something we see a lot. I would qualify also by saying that in my day-to-day job talking to quote-unquote regular people, a lot of people do not have time to think about this stuff. A lot of people are struggling to make ends meet. They're being, like you said, like Lev said, bombarded with bad news and maybe some disinformation as well. But so a lot of people aren't paying attention and don't have time. Even in a far-right Republican-controlled state like I live in, they're not always following the state legislature where most of this kind of policy comes out of. So I think we have to keep that in mind too, that when we're mostly in an elite crowd thinking like, okay, we've got to protect democracy, but a lot of people are just basically struggling and they don't have time to focus on this. So that would be mine. I'll try to think of something positive to say the next time the mic comes to me.
David, are you going to bring us positive or go negative?
You know, I don't know. I haven't thought about it yet. You know, the situation is so, one thing is positive. Public opinion poll data, regardless of left-right divisions or anything else, strongly indicate that most Americans, if you ask the question right, want to drink clean water, breathe clean air. They really don't want climate chaos. And so if you put the question to them, there's a huge majority of us. We're a majority. The problem we have is, in a way, those of us on this side of the chasm supporting all the right things that most people would accept in this room don't affect what happens on the other side of the chasm. The other side of the chasm is where laws and regulations and so forth are made. The problem is that the bridge that ought to connect those two sides has been rendered into a toll bridge that's accessible only to the wealthy. And so first order of business, end Citizens United. Take money out of politics. End the corruption. The situation, two other comments on this. Boeing faced an issue of how to redevelop their 737, their flagship plane. And it was designed back 60 years ago, went into production 50 years ago, and so that plane had mechanical systems and all kinds of stuff that was outdated, badly outdated. So what they decided to do was a patch job on the 737. You all know what happened then. Two planes crashed because they were unmanageable, no electronic controls, no disaster prevention systems. 400 or some such people lost their lives. They needed to do a systems rebuild, start from scratch. Now, we can't do that, but we can go back and consider some of the DNA, the structural issues that control our politics. To start with the Constitution. That document was written in between 1787 and 1789 by mostly white men, slave owners. And in that document, if that document was rewritten now with what we know about how the earth works as a physical system, what would that document look like? That's a world that has leads and lags and lots of nasty surprises and things are interlinked. That would be a different document now. And so we're saddled with all kind of absurdities. Montana and California both have 2 senators. Montana has 10 people and 40 million cows. California has 40 million people and 10 cows. Each get 2 senators. Now something's wrong. We have to go back and begin to rethink some of the basics by which we do the public business. And I think the public is ready for that.
Thank you, David. Lev, what do you think about the different levels of government and coordination of climate response?
I'd like to try to integrate David's and Claudine's points about the strength of the judiciary and also thinking about the case Citizens United. And if you're thinking, what is Citizens United? This is what I'd like to contribute. The most important thing at all levels is an informed citizenry. So if you're thinking, what is David referring to? In 2010, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations could exercise their freedom of speech and create super PACs and donate indirectly to political campaigns without limit, whereas average citizens like you and me are capped at $2,500 for a presidential campaign. This is the money in politics. The informed citizenry is what we need. And if I'm thinking about, okay, what do I do, Claudine, about the force of the judiciary and how do I push back against Citizens United? Or think about Denver, 2022, it was listed as the 7th worst city for the air quality when it came to particulates. And 2021, it was listed as one of the 7th worst cities in the world for air quality. What the hell do we do? You know, I'm just one person. And this is where I would say, if I'm talking to my students, if I'm talking to neighbors who I have, start local. You know, I don't know if the impact's going to rise up, but the idea is to be informed, to take some action. You go to a town hall meeting, have a conversation. What you're doing here is valuable. Don't understate this. This is part of taking reins, of feeling like an intractable, unmanageable problem, and trusting that as more and more people talk about this, the ideas coalesce, we will find agreement and try to improve. Because at base, I agree with Kirk. We generally will agree on a lot of the priorities regardless of our walks of life, our backgrounds, our political ideologies. When it comes down to standards of living, that's where we need to find that overlap, and it happens with conversations like this. So keep at it.
I just want to interject a little piece of good news here related to Citizens United. Not that it's going to be overturned anytime soon, but given the fact that some of you are taking notes, and I appreciate that, because there's an organization called As You Sow that advises investors. And they just recently came out with a report of the 20 top CEOs that the executive pay for the CEOs in the top 20 corporations. And what's interesting to me that the media does not cover is that we talk about this income disparity, and it has a lot to do when you look at the fact that so many of our corporations have had profits, outlandish profits in the last couple of years, and the CEOs have had outlandish pay. So that too says our corporations are not really hurting, it's just the distribution of those corporate funds. But what's also interesting is that on March 7th, I was at the National Press Club, and the University of Michigan Herb Center announced the beginning of something called corporate social responsibility. And it is an effort to get corporations to agree to 4 basic principles and to stand on those when it comes to political giving, which is out of control right now, if you hadn't noticed. And not only to have a foundation to stand on, but to have other corporations join them so they're not standing alone. So IBM was one of the first companies there, Pirelli Tire, Dannon, Ford Motor, a number of others are joining. And it's absolutely critical that we look closely at where are those corporate dollars going when it comes to financing the seditionists, now morphing into democracy. If you look at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, shorthand is CREW, they will give you a list of all of the top corporations that are continuing to finance the seditionists, the folks who were part of the January 6th insurrection. So corporations play a huge role, and you as consumers play an important role in where you shop, but also where you invest your money. And if you're not investing in what is known as ESG funds, environment, social, and governance funds, then you are completely part of the problem. So if anybody wants more information on any of the things I'm sharing with you, see me afterwards. I'll be happy to give you more info.
I was going to... Am I on? Yeah. I thought of something positive, but it does start with doom. But an example of a real visible thing that can galvanize action when it comes to climate change in a state whose leaders for quite some time denied human-caused climate change was a thing, not all state leaders, but just next door to us in Utah. So you have you also have some of the dirtiest air in the country in Salt Lake City as a result of the basin topography, but largely because of the vehicle emissions and the oil refinery and the international airport. You also have a lake, the namesake lake, which is now under threat of drying up in 5 years, which, among other things, the Great Salt Lake drying up seems like not something we can even wrap our heads around, but now the leaders of Utah know that it's possibly going to happen. And so what that would even do to air quality alone in the Salt Lake City area, which many people, another thing about the West, a lot of people think of the West as cowboys and sagebrush, which is true, but most of us Westerners live in cities. And most of the West is big cities. Salt Lake City the area has 3 million people. So if you've got dust storms blowing up toxins from the dried up lake bed, you've got an environmental disaster that Utah and perhaps the West hasn't seen since the Owens Valley of California, which, by the way, did not have a 3 million person town next to it. That's not to say that many people there did not suffer from dust storms after Los Angeles diverted the water away from the Owens River. But to sum up, the state legislature and the governor has pledged, and local news reporters are pledging to hold him accountable, that the Great Salt Lake is not going to dry up under our watch. And we are going to broker some deals with alfalfa farmers who have been diverting a lot of water, much like in the rest of the West. Agricultural diversions have led to the Great Salt Lake shrinking, but it's also just the fact that we're in a 23-year mega drought. But I think that there is some hope when a broad section of people in Salt Lake City is sort of a liberal-run government, but with an overarching, very conservative state. But people there are getting together because they've got a serious crisis on their hands, and they look at it every day. So sometimes I think it just takes something like that.
Thank you, Kirk. We did get some light at the end. Thank you for that. One of the points Kirk brought up earlier, which is that people have no time for this, is a really important point to me about democracy, because not only do we count on an educated voting base, we count on a attentive voting base that cares about the issues. And so one of the questions I have for the panel is, how do we make such a big problem as climate change something relatable to people in their daily lives? Because it's hard to convince people, hey, we didn't have a flood or we didn't have a plane crash, so your life is better, because they don't really experience the alternative. So how do we get people to understand that this is something that affects them? And how do we get them to understand how it affects them, or how it might? And I'd like to start with Lev on that. Sorry to put you on the spot, Lev, but how do we get people to pay attention?
Well, short of crises, I mean, there's also this anticipation that, look, we'll get through. You know, you look at Cape Town. My students in my environmental sustainability class just wrapped up a discussion on water sustainability. And look how they came together, and they reduced their water consumption by 50% so quickly. Luckily, the rains came as well, so we can't attribute everything to the individual behavior changes. But I trust that it doesn't take a crisis to bring us together. Maybe as we're seeing the problems unfold, we will act more rapidly. But I still lean on the idea of an informed citizenry. The work that Kirk does, for instance, is invaluable. The work that David does with publishing, the work that Claudine does in reaching constituents. These conversations need to happen, and if people aren't able to take the time, I'm trusting at least that in those closer circles, the local efforts, knowing the problems that we face, that those conversations will sort of trickle out, and we will be able to make some broader changes. But I think that in some way or another, these issues need to be the expectation of folks who are experienced with these topics, folks like you who are interested in these topics. It is demonstrating to people who know you why you care about these topics that is going to help broach those conversations. I'm still wrestling with some of the cynicism myself of the cost-benefit analysis and how to get people really changing their behavior. But some way or another, it is reflecting on the problems that face our local communities that I think are the best way to get those conversations started. Excellent. David?
I think the problem for education, in a way, students know all the stuff we talk about. They know all the bad news. And what they don't know is what they do about it. And the question for us is, how do we introduce them to a world where hope is still possible, and where you can have a career and a life being on the right side of the issue? And I think the worst thing that we do is give false hope, feel-good hope. And so how do we begin to develop a teaching mechanism that draws students in and gives them something to do? Let me give an example. In Oberlin, back in the early 1990s, we started a project to develop a building. We needed a building for the environmental studies program, and we started a project that involved about 250 students. And the first thing we did was to say, okay, what kind of building do you want? What's the building program? What's it do? And what's it do in the world? And I mentioned yesterday, one of the panels, that they had fairly strict standards. They wanted a building that caused no ugliness, human or ecological, somewhere else at some later time. Think about that. That's like truth, beauty, and justice. You try to strive to get there, you're never going to quite get there, but that's the goal. You got to do that. And then they wanted a building that was powered entirely by sunlight. And my response back to them was, where you live, Oberlin, Ohio, is as cloudy as Seattle. And they wanted to build in zero discharge building. You flush a toilet and no wastewater leaves the building. So one of the options was put the toilets in another building. Or just be more disciplined about things. Nancy Reagan's solution, just say no. But what the building did, and we did it, it was 14,200 square foot building. It was the first entirely solar powered zero discharge building on a U.S. college campus. We now replicated that in a 105,000 square foot hotel, entirely solar powered, again at Oberlin, platinum rated. But what happened here was interesting. It wasn't the building that was important, it was the effect on students' minds. All of a sudden, they could begin to see something that was tangible. In 14,200 square foot building, you can get your mind around that. Climate change, in some ways, is too big to get your mind around. It's just too exhaustingly large. But a building you can understand. And then they could see, they worked with people from Bill McDonough to people from NASA and Amory Lovins and a whole bunch of heroic people. And they now had a face to put on the word courage. They could understand that. They were their friends and they collaborated on this building that took about 3 years to design and build. And then they went out, they could see their place in the world. They went out into the world, and a lot of the kids went off into things like development of the right sort, philanthropy, writing, but they could begin to carve out careers that would help change the world and enough. But imagine if every university said, okay, we want a pedagogy that engages young people in solutions and get away from optimism or pessimism. We can't deal with either end of that. Just do things, roll up your sleeves and begin to do things. So if there's hope, I said yesterday in one of the panels that hope is a verb with sleeves rolled up. It means if you're hopeful, you'll do something. And our job in the education world is, I think, to give them things to do that solve problems at a scale that is comprehensible. And even at that scale, they learn the discipline of systems thinking. Systems doesn't have to be big stuff. It can be buildings where you worry about the effect of the shell, the insulation, and the glazing of the building and so forth on the budget, and you're balancing all kinds of things. They can learn systems thinking in a building or in a farm. And most every problem we have is systemic. We need a generation that understands linkages between problems. So I think the last thing I'd say is this. One of the events we did before I left Oberlin was a conference on State of American Democracy. Our closing speaker was William Barber. All of you know William Barber. He's probably the best speaker in the United States. African-American, incredibly eloquent and very, very smart. Started the Poor People's Campaign. He now works at Yale. He closed his comments by saying, our ideas are too puny for our circumstances. Think about that. Where do we get non-puny ideas? If a university can't do that, let's begin to think outside the proverbial box, connecting ideas. And if we're going to make it, we've got to think of things we haven't thought of yet, much in the same way that this country was founded by people, again, fallible people, slave owners, many of them, but they were thinking of how you give birth to democracy, this idea that we the people mattered. And there's something important here. Was it perfect? No. But was it a good idea? Yes. Was it a fertile idea? Absolutely. Thanks.
Thank you, David. And I'm going to take a pause here, and I haven't had our last two panelists comment on that question because I want to move on to the student questions because I think the answers will be require a lot of time to think about. And I'm going to start with the first one, which is a simple question, and I'm going to come to you, Claudine, with this and then go down the line. But how can young people feel like they have a voice in our democracy? I ask it just the way it was written because I think it's existential and important.
I think that young people can have a voice in democracy by being part of an organization. One person, it's a solo, but when you form a chorus, your strength is so much greater. You saw what the students were doing about guns in Tennessee. Fantastic. They needed the mothers and the fathers and the teachers to join them too. So coming together for students is critical. Number two, you do not need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to democracy. There are so many outstanding nonprofit organizations already working on various aspects of democracy, whether it's redistricting or voter enlistment or signing up new voters. There are so many different things that you can do. What you need to understand by looking in the mirror is figuring out what is your passion, what do you really care about when it comes to being part of the solution for democracy. And then either I can give you the name of a great organization or you can Google it, but there are plenty of them, and organize your friends to join with it. And in addition to democracy, let me just mention climate. Here in Colorado, we have something called CCLC, the Colorado Coalition for a Livable Climate. There are 43 nonprofit organizations that are part of this coalition. I am not an active participant, but I'm on their listserv. All of you can donate a few dollars, but pay attention. Their sole focus is on the state legislature and on climate here in Colorado. And I am blown away at how effective and professional they are. But each of them need more members, they need more money and more support. And if you are part of the university and you care about democracy and climate, you ought to be part of Mission Zero. And even if you're not a student, if you are a retiree, they need financial support. A few individuals came together to initiate this with their funding, but there's more funding that is necessary to hone in on the students here at CU and to help them be part of the solution.
Very good, thank you. And Kirk, how can young people feel like they have a voice in our democracy?
Well, I think I prefaced at the top, sometimes as reporters we're uncomfortable with big picture questions like this because it's not our role. I would say that there are quite a few inspiring movements going on of young people right in our backyard. I get pitched very frequently about a group of high school and some college students in the Pacific Northwest who have mobilized to protect, if not save, and help the tribes save the imperiled salmon. Most of which do not make it up to the headwaters as they used to, as we well know, for a myriad of reasons, climate change chief among them. There are some examples of younger legislators in rural states like Montana, 21-year-old state lawmakers. But I think that's born out of this sort of generational issue right now of younger people feeling as though they're being cast aside. I mean, most of our leaders are old and, no offense. But, in my hometown, there's not my hometown, but my adopted hometown right now, there's a 18-year-old who successfully got himself on the local school board by saying that, we don't have a voice. How ironic is that? Students don't have a voice on our school board. So if I was going to step into an advocacy role, I would try to make a pitch that young people should be getting into journalism. Because the odds are stacked against us right now. Every day in the headlines, there's another example of a small-town newspaper laying 15 more people off based on some decisions made in a boardroom elsewhere about cutting something. Now, this is similar to what's going on in the American West, where decisions are being made in other countries sometimes that affect small-town communities. But hopefully, we are going to come up with a way to start funding local news operations in a more robust manner. There's an example in Colorado here called the Colorado Sun that gets held up quite a bit. It's still fledgling, but I gather it's having some success at that. So I think that's how we might address the trust and the gap issue if we could get some more people getting into journalism and working local news, because people still trust, based on surveys, tend to trust the local reporter more than the national reporter. And there's good reason for that, but what if there's no local reporter anymore, which is the case in many of these places. So I'm increasingly, as a reporter, speaking to an echo chamber because of the hyper-partisanship in American politics and American news media. But I think if there's a way forward, hopefully more younger people will be getting into journalism don't read the headlines. There is a future, but I think that's one way we could address this.
David.
I think they agree with all that. I think the question for me is, what is the role of higher education in dealing with that question? And so, again, back to the standard we started at ASU, Arizona State University. No student, whatever your major, can graduate without understanding Earth system science, what planet you're on and how it works, period. So when Amy Coney Barrett, I do mean to be political here, at her hearing in Washington was asked about climate change, she said, well, she'd heard of it, but she didn't really have an opinion about it, didn't know much about it. How do you get out of a law school without knowing what planet you're going to practice law on? Come on. How does that happen? And so lawyers, business people, everybody needs to know how the Earth works as a physical system and how their decisions in lives are going to affect it. So my response to that is, let's make sure if young people have a voice, it's an informed voice. They know some things. And not just about how the Earth works physically, but how democracy is important. Now, this is the rub, because most people don't see democracy as an effective way to do the public business. And it is messy, it is slow, and it's never done. But the point is, let's educate people, let's put civics back in the curriculum, both in public schools and also in the university. So nobody gets out of a university or college environment without understanding the basics of democracy and why it's important and how we're going to improve it. That's Democracy 4.0. There's a challenge. But we're not failing because people don't want to do stuff. We're not failing because it's not economic to do what we're talking about doing. We're failing because we haven't structured things, and we're wallowing in not a sea of ignorance, but with a lot of ignorance pervading important decisions. If I was to poll members of Congress, how many members of Congress, those 435 representatives, how many do you think could pass an 8th grade test on Earth system science?
Or on democracy.
Claudine adds, or on democracy. Well, it's even a lower number there, At least it made about laws of gravity, but voting. Well, anyway, I'm off on a tangent. But how many? I mean, seriously, we have, but if you get a driver's license, you have to go and take a test. You have to know what the lights mean and what the various shapes of signs mean, and you have to know something about the rules of the road. But in politics, you don't have to know anything about the rules of the road, so you can drive the country into a ditch. And ignorance has done that. So I'm off on a tangent, and I didn't bring the little pills that keep me calm. So.
Lev, if you have any spare pills, David needs some.
No, I really appreciate the question, and as an educator, one of the things that I hope my students will think about, and sometimes I try to push them explicitly toward the end of the semester, is to think about the notion of being an engaged citizen. What does it mean to be a community member? This is a really unique time in young people's lives. They don't know where they're going to end up, what career they're going to be taking on, and it's exciting. And regardless of where you see yourself, I mean, for me, there's sort of two-part response to this thoughtful question, that I would encourage young people to think about the community that they envision themselves in, and then think practically about what they can do for that community. Again, try to bring it down into something that is reasonable, taking seriously David's point about not encouraging false hope. I don't know if anyone in this room, aside from Claudine, has really shaped public policy. Is that the aim? You need to create reasonable expectations for yourself so that those small accomplishments still feel quite meaningful. So for me, that's the first part. And don't understate the value that your individual actions can have on the perceptions of other people. You create that role model. You create the expectation by being engaged. So I love the idea of joining a city council, joining some advisory board of a city council, going to town hall meetings. This is low-hanging fruit. It just takes the time. Conscientious consumerism, so this came up with Claudine's point earlier. There are little things that we can do. Whether or not that's going to have a big impact, if that's how you view your voice being heard, this is sort of context dependent on what your own expectations are. My thought is, for practical sake, network. Faculty do this too. What can we do for our department? What can we do for our college? How can I contribute to campus initiatives? You start small. You go to a meeting, you listen, you introduce yourself, you say, I'm such and such, I've got this interest. Keep me in mind if something comes up. Network, network, network. And you get one opportunity, and then people start realizing this is someone who is trustworthy, engaged, meaningfully contributes, and they invite you to another opportunity. Some internship comes along. Fill in the blank. I mean, it's keeping eyes open, but being proactive. And I think it starts with things like this, and meet the audience, meet the panelists, chat amongst each other, figure out what those opportunities are that you might not even be aware of. It starts with those conversations.
Yeah, thank you so much to everybody for those answers. I think I'll give a short answer to it. Show up. Because showing up is the first step towards all of the things that were talked about. And so being here is showing up. Thank you for that, and show up more. So I have another student question. This one comes from a student at Western Colorado University who may have written this online. But here's the question. How can the U.S. claim to be a leader in democracy when our votes are filtered through a strategic electoral college and we have a very partisan and powerful Supreme Court? So it's how can we claim to be a leader in democracy when those things are true, and how do we lead in the climate crisis with such a split country? And for this, I will start with Kirk. Come on, Kirk. I'm giving you some time to compose your thoughts, but.
Well, there is a lot of, I like to think that I have a little bit more pulse on the electorate than the average Beltway-based news reporter. We're pretty centralized, even at NPR, on the coasts. But I do hear that a lot, that frustration about the Electoral College. You mentioned the senators from Montana versus California. I keep using the adopted state that I live in. Don't quote me, but the electoral power they have in a state like Idaho in the Electoral College is something close to tenfold of California. But yet California is the 6th largest, 5th, 7th largest economy in the world. So I think there are a lot of frustrations like that. I think in the news media, in some sense, the onus is on us to perhaps do a better job of shining a light on things that might be working, toward that end, like different democratic organizations and communities, people getting together from different sides of the spectrum, which is rarer and rarer these days. But I think we could be doing a little bit better job of shifting the narrative a little bit away from what you see the daily controversy that starts on Twitter and manifests through the cable talk shows that then ends up in the New York Times, that then is covered by NPR, that is just this vicious cycle, and we never seem to be getting out of it. So I guess I'm hopeful that maybe there will be a little bit more attention on some of these more grassroots local efforts to change that. Because I think it is a big frustration that you hear right now. People do not feel as though they have a voice, and in many cases they don't. And even by some of the people claiming to give them a voice, that's sort of the irony that, in fact, in the end, they may not have their best interests at heart. But I do think there is a growing movement, and it is, as the questionnaire said, it's a very big obstacle to try to confront when all of the deck may be stacked in one certain way. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. David, what do you think?
I think the question really nailed our plight, and the question is its own answer. We've got hard work to do to reform democracy, and over here is climate change. That thin white line out there on the horizon is that tsunami of climate change approaching our little beach. And if I think that we will not survive that collision of climate disaster as a democratic society. So this is a time test, as Bill McKibben puts it. We have a limited amount of time, and we've got to do a lot of reform work quickly. The good news is, I think there is a majority of Americans that would dispense with Citizens United that Lev explained, and the Electoral College very likely, and lots of other things. I think there's a majority of us here to do that. Let me add one other thing. One of the things we're trying to do in the CDI and the Arizona State work is to develop a leadership program that takes young people, sophomore year and on, accelerates their education, gives them the skills of real leadership, everything from how the earth works physically to how you organize a meeting and raise money and do a budget and all that kind of thing, and accelerate their movement into American society so they get to places of real importance. sooner than they otherwise might. But to tap the leadership potential of this young generation that I think is eager to lead, let's help them in that process. And let's do it not just here at Colorado University, but at Arizona State University and every one of the 3,800 colleges and universities across the country. Let's develop a leadership program of tens of thousands of young people willing to roll up their sleeves and attack these big problems that seem so unsolvable. And after we solve them, we'll look back and realize they weren't that big a deal. It wasn't that big a deal to solve those things. And with a majority of Americans and people around the world that want us to solve it, they are solvable kinds of things. We just have to roll up our sleeves, and Claudine, I think, is exactly right. You can't do that as an individual. It's organizations that matter. Ultimately, that's the test of our ability to pull things together where 2 + 2 isn't 4, it's 22.
Great. Lev, how do we lead in democracy in the presence of the Electoral College?
That is a thoughtful question that I don't think this thoughtful panel can adequately answer. It's a multifaceted problem that requires multifaceted solutions, and I don't know if disbanding the Electoral College is the answer. One of the things that I try to emphasize to my students is that when I was their age, I was a quasi-militant environmentalist. And it irritated me, it aggravated me, it was unsettling and created apathy in realizing we need quick action and we need it now. Yes, absolutely we do, but we also have to, in my humble estimation, settle in for the long haul, because I mean, that tsunami is, if you want to carry that analogy, it's coming, it's here. It is, we as a species are going to persevere. We have the capacity to persevere. It might take the crisis, it might be swimming in the tsunami waters, but I'm confident that we will work through it. But I also am a strong proponent of working within the system. And so what I would say is a sort of a politician's move is to sidestep the question, to say, I don't know if we can be a leader in democracy, or if we are a leader in democracy. Yeah, I look at environmental racism in Flint, Michigan. I look at Jackson, Mississippi with the water quality. We've got the vaccine nationalism. You know, there's still a very large population in the world that has yet to receive a single vaccine for the COVID-19 pandemic. I look at gun violence. Tyree Nichols, one of the more recent headlines. Boulder was affected by the mass shooting at the King Soopers a few years ago. I think that what we need to do before we start thinking about these specific technical questions is to take a hard look in the mirror and critically, conscientiously reflect on our own shortcomings. And at that point, I hope that some of these answers will become a little clearer. But I would take issue with the premise of the question that we already are.
Thank you so much. And Claudine, what do you have to say about this?
I'm just going to keep it very short of pleading the fifth. But I will say that on a hopeful note, there is a group of bipartisan former members of Congress that are attempting to craft some legislation looking at the Electoral College. But let me also say, good ideas are one thing. Getting them implemented is the other. And the other is, as a Republican, I'm saying to all of you, probably preaching to the choir here, I do not see any Republicans today that are representing the public interest. They are representing special interests of either the corporate world, the churches, whatever it might be. And I think it is incumbent upon us to pick up on tsunami, to have a tsunami of Democrats who have a singular focus on problem solving, to have an overwhelming election of Democrats, to send a very clear message that this Republican Party has to reconstitute itself so people like me can feel welcomed again rather than on the outskirts. So help the Democrats get elected.
Very good. So thanks for those thoughts. And I'm going to close with the last question. We have about 3 minutes left. And I think this one kind of is a nice follow-on to the last one, which is how can democratic countries, or in our case, mostly democratic country, influence more autocratic countries into working towards more environmentally friendly solutions? So that gets more to the global level of government. Anyone have any thoughts on that you'd like to share? I'm going to call on you if you don't raise your hand.
I think, just very briefly, like anything else, If we want to influence others, we need to lead by example. So we need to get our own house in order, because for decades, centuries, people have looked at the United States for the answers, and we've had them, but now we're slipping backwards. So until we get our own house in order, we will not have much influence around the world.
I was just going to say briefly, bringing you back to the Brazilian Amazon, it's also a question of consumerism. There's some hardwoods that come out of the Amazon that are very coveted in Europe and other countries, other Western nations. And China has a big interest in getting meat from Brazil. So it can all, it's sort of geopolitical too, I think, is wrapped up in this too, and where all of our stuff that we have grown to find luxurious comes from.
I'm into both of those. I would add only, I think we have to reckon with money and the way money works in the system. And money overrides our preferences. Yesterday there was a report released that showed that something like $6 trillion of lending from major American banks to the fossil fuel industry goes under the radar screen. We don't think much about it, but how money works is really critical. So the old lawyer's technique of follow the money, we've got to solve that before we can move on.
Very good. Well, we're at the end of our panel, and I want to thank you all for the most valuable thing you can give, your attention to the subject. And so thank you to the panelists. Let's give a round of applause to everyone.
Thanks, guys.
I'm so excited to meet you. I'm such a-
Thank you for attending the session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Hope I didn't disappoint.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.